We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
From my first report, I can present the solid scientific evidence to our audience that this virus, COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 virus, actually is not from nature. I work with the top coronavirologists in the world. This is created in the lab. This is from that template owned by China military. And also it is spread to the world to make such damage.
To make such damage, do you believe the Chinese government released this intentionally, on purpose? Did they do this?
Yes, of course, it's intentionally.
In this context, you have to understand where Li Meng comes from. She was from mainland China. She came to Hong Kong. She had a change in information environment and, realized that, China has fed her, for most of her life, a very well-crafted alternative narrative of what reality is. So she already was very much leaning anti-CCP. Then she is in this, and then there was this mystery about where does this virus come from. And she started, getting into her own world and creating this idea that it might have been a bioweapon, and then started pushing this idea that this might have been a Chinese military thing. And immediately she got picked up by these manipulators in the West.
Some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus. We'll be invoking the Defense Production Act just in case we need it.
Nowadays, it's not a secret that the Trump administration has like this big Govt lab leak page coming out. They were very strongly involved in the bioweapon story in the beginning of 2020. This was a plot to kind of, deflect blame from the poor handling of the pandemic in the US towards China. So the Trump administration had multiple agents, not only this Hong Kong whistleblower that Steve Bannon cultivated, but they also had, other activists and groups in their circle that really that was their whole strategy to say don't blame Trump for pandemic failings, blame the whole pandemic on China instead.
The precise location had been narrowed down to a specific wet market in Wuhan. However, those early studies have since been brought into refute. It remains unclear and unlikely that a pangolin was involved. In addition, the established timeline of the outbreak, which enables researchers to identify a specific wet market, is also under question. It seems most likely that bats were the original carriers, but other details are unclear. Wet markets are common in Asia, where many locals shop for groceries. In some, live animals are available for slaughter and sold for consumption. A wide variety of animals can be kept in close proximity, stacked atop one another in squalid conditions. Hygiene is compromised when fluids from animal slaughter or excretions mix. These conditions create an opportunity for a virus to make the jump between other animals, which can then infect humans when handled or consumed. A metaphorical petri dish cultivating potential infection combinations.
The Chinese never admitted it coming from the wildlife market. They never pushed it coming from the wildlife market. In fact, they tried to suppress any kind of mention that it could have come from the wildlife market or from China. And so this idea that, because the Chinese are not transparent, that means it was a lab leak, is completely, people have completely the wrong way around. They suppress any narrative that it comes from China, and it's more embarrassing to a certain extent if it would have come from the wet wildlife market, because after SARS-1, they promised to clear up the act. They tried to portray themselves as this modern, technological, superior culture, and having, this wildlife trade, this cultural practices, very embarrassing for them.
Hi everyone, my guest today is a scientist and a science journalist, Dr. Philipp Markolin. He holds a PhD in translational biomedicine and a postdoctorate in bioinformatics and biological sciences. He's the author of the book Lab Leak Fever. This book explores the origins of SARS-CoV-2. Dr. Philipp has personally talked to several scientists to understand the origin of SARS-CoV-2 and how the scientific community was harassed by political and self-serving agents. This book examines evidence from wildlife, markets, and lab research. It shows how scientists face harassment, doxing, and political pressure while investigating the virus. Now, the book also explores and exposes a network of actors, activists, and agendas that work hard to sabotage ordinary scientific inquiry for vested interests. This book details scientific evidence about the natural origin of the virus, and this book has garnered a lot of praise from the scientific community and is a fascinating read. Dr. Philipp also publishes on Substack under the newsletter Protagonist Science, where he writes about misinformation and how modern information ecosystems shape public understanding of scientific issues. So welcome, Dr. Philipp. Great to be talking to you. How are you?
Thank you so much, Ali, for having me. And happy to chat about this and whatever else comes up.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk to me. So it's a fascinating read. Your book must have taken you a lot of time, like we were discussing before recording. How long did it take you to talk to everybody and compile everything in a book format?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, it started more gradually, right? We started with this other science communicator, some Gregson from the UK, to just, figure out do a couple of interviews with virologists. What's the state of the evidence, right? And then you go deeper, you get to know more people. Then there was this documentary filmmaker, Christian Frey, from Switzerland, that kind of came upon my writing, and then he invited me to basically join his documentary movie, and he was already close with Peter Daszak, from EcoHealth Alliance, and the woman Sheng Dixi and Lim Fa Wang. So I got another leg into these virologists. Then we went in the field in Thailand. We got to meet a lot more virus hunters there. And from there, you start collecting more and more people. You talk to some, then they open the door for you to talk to the next person. Sometimes you have to cold write and say, hey, look, I did this piece on recommendation. Can we chat about your research about it, right? Stuff like this. And so you start collecting more and more stories and testimony from people that actually know what they're talking about. And overall, the book took around 4 years, I would say, with at least 2 years of a really intensive work. And I would say 2 more years of just getting to know what's going on, and kind of getting the landscape first. But then another 2 years of really, especially when we talk about, the antagonists and the agendas that you outlined a little bit. Because when you tell a book, right, you cannot just you have to have some kind of angle, you have to have some kind of story. I cannot do a book where I just say, this is what the scientist said and that's how it went. Because it's usually not how life works. Life is more complicated. And so what I kind of try to do in the book is I try to tell the story of the scientists when they made a key discovery, but then what happened to them because of it. So every time when they found something new that would contradict this idea that the virus came from the lab, that it has a natural origin, they kind of got into trouble for that, right? And so I had to do a lot of also, it's called OSINT, so this kind of open source intelligence research, trying to figure out, who were the manipulators in the back, what did they do, how did they gain from kind of perpetrating this lab leak narrative. And this, of course, gets you quickly into dicey waters, I would say, with some of these actors, of course, because some of them are very powerful people. I mean, we know nowadays it's not a secret that the Trump administration has like this big Govt lab leak page coming out. They were very strongly involved in the bioweapon story in the beginning of 2020. This was a plot to kind of, deflect blame from the poor handling of the pandemic in the US towards China. So the Trump administration had multiple agents, not only this Hong Kong whistleblower that Steve Bannon cultivated, but they also had, other activists and groups in their circle that really that was their whole strategy to say, don't blame Trump for pandemic failings, blame the whole pandemic on China instead. So this was one of the angles that when you look into it, and most of the information is public, some of it had to be put in the right context, some of it came out when you talk to some protagonists or people that study this information. So the book is not only a virologist, it also has, a cognitive psychologist, it has disinformation researchers, just to contextualize a little bit what was happening when it was happening. So this took a lot of time to make sure that, you have all these different strings of evidence and what the people did, and then how do you put this together? How do you make sure that, you're accurate, but also that people don't get hopelessly lost? Because, at some point there is so many different people and actors doing certain things. So what I try to do is really go through the key events that really shaped, public perception in a large way. And try to figure out what were the root causes. And some of this mentioned was the bioweapon one, came from this Hong Kong postdoc, Dr. Li-Meng Yang, that were cultivated by this Chinese billionaire and Steve Bannon together. They created this right-wing media sensation. That was most of 2020. In 2021, you had a different angle. You had the gain of function moral panic. So this is kind of storytellers and bloggers and this activist group US Right to Know, which was an anti-GMO organization, jumped on to be anti-virology organization. They started cultivating this fear of gain of function research, right? And virologists, gain of function as a scientist is like, it doesn't say anything about if it's dangerous or not. It's a very functional description, not a description if it's dangerous or not. And there then you outline, okay, so they started with this storytelling, and then after that, you see they got the pickup in the media. It kind of cascaded from, bloggers to news outlets into the ultimately into the highest levels of power, with the Biden administration doing this 90-day intelligence review, all based on, a good story, I would say, during a traumatic time. This was after the winter of 2020, so the first winter without the vaccines. There were lots of casualties, lots of deaths, a lot of pandemic frustration piling on, a lot of trauma, many people dying. And so, of course, people wanted to blame, and then you have a narrative that blamed a very clear agent, which is the scientists that, first they put us into lockdown, they want to force vaccine into our arms, how convenient would it be if they were to blame for the pandemic as well? And this succeeded a lot. Then there were some other stories about, the genetic engineering fantasies about, this virus, although, for years everybody knew it had no hallmarks of genetic engineering. It's a natural rise. Suddenly they start fantasizing about, what if we find synthetic fingerprints into this, and, people run with it and so forth, right? So I outline all of these kind of disinformation campaigns that, sometimes it started as rumors, then morphed into more kind of weaponized disinformation along the way. Sometimes it started right off the bat as disinformation. Sometimes it started as a kind of as a popular sentiment of a certain unease that's get then cultivated by some of these actors, and then ultimately the powerful people, the elites in media, in business, in politics, they then start, once you have an emotional angle to something, they start using it for their agendas, and then it has very little to do with the original controversy. And this is also what I outlined in the book. Some of these actors, they didn't jump on it because they had a special insight or they had a special interest in where the virus came from. It just became politically so convenient to use the story to kind of advance their own agenda, might it be popularity, profit, or power, which I try to say. And usually this is what I outlined. And so this makes it, of course, a bit tricky to also publish this book then in the US. I had a publisher after Trump got reelected, and some of the people in his power did, the director of the CIA, who got a bit criticized in my book for his involvement with the Heritage Foundation, but also other actors around Trump and his circle, and the president himself. The publisher ultimately decided to kill the book. Not the publisher, the lawyers of the publisher said it's too risky. There's a war in universities going on, there's scientific defunding going on, and any negative spotlight would be too much for this printing press that was associated with the college. So this kind of got me into the hot waters, and this is kind of the very short version of why this book is a bit controversial in the sense of, like, nobody could have published it that easily unless you're like me sitting in Switzerland. I don't have to worry so much what the Chinese might do to me. I don't have to worry so much what the US can do to me as long as I stay in Switzerland. I'm rather safe, and so I can speak out for what I perceived to be, the truth of what really happened, and featuring, what the scientists said. Some other people don't have the luxury. I mean, in the US, scientists cannot easily speak out without severe repercussion, without becoming targets for congressional investigations, witch hunt, domestic terrorism threats, and so forth. And in China is kind of the opposite coin. You cannot speak up against the state narrative, which is the virus came from anywhere but from China. So the Chinese state does not support the idea that, this started from a wildlife market or from a lab. For them, it's like, they love the idea that it came from a lab, because then they can blame the US and say it came from Fort Detrick in the US. They don't love the idea to say, look, there's the wildlife trade going on in southern China and also Southeast Asia. You come over the porous borders, you bring these animals that are infected with viruses, and along the wildlife chain, they cross-infect each other, and you breed kind of the right conditions for a virus like SARS-CoV-2, which is a generalist virus that can kind of, jump multiple species, right? And this is also what was so surprising to this virus, that from the get-go, it was able to infect, a multitude of species, right? It went into mink, deer, hamsters, anywhere in the world, right? And this is not because genetic engineers were tinkering it so that it's better to infect deer and mink and whatever. It's because the wildlife trade with multi-species, stacked on each other, really allows viruses to explore evolutionarily different ways to infect mammals. And we as humans are one part of the mammals, and this virus learned to infect us along that way. And then when it started to come to the big city, which is usually the end point of this wildlife trade, is in one of these Chinese mega cities at the wildlife market, from there it started spreading and radiating outwards. So yeah, that was a bit of the short overview. Yeah.
Thanks for that. So you mentioned in your book that it started, scientific evidence suggests that it started from Huanan market in Wuhan. Then it spread from there, and there are scientific research articles written on that. But, and I'm going to ask you a question about that later, but before that, so you've done all this research for 4 years. How has been the reception for your work? From the scientific community and from people who don't really agree with the scientific narrative?
So I think the reception has been positive for people that actually got to see the book. However, I think the popular zeitgeist at the moment is still not very much in our favor in that sense. So people are not yet ready. There's pandemic fatigue, everything that has to do with the pandemic, people just don't want to hear about it at the moment. So any book about, the virus is like, okay, I might be interesting maybe a few years from now, but now I don't want to revisit this time. There's the trauma associated with it. So I wouldn't say there's a widespread adoption yet. Like you said, the scientific community, I think, is very positive about this because, ultimately, this is an evidence-driven book. It is really laying out kind of, it gives an account, a fair account of what happened. And I think this is well appreciated for people that were somewhat involved or had colleagues involved or understand how scientific processes work. For them, this is kind of a more coherent and understandable explanation of this controversy than what is usually offered in the mainstream media or in alternative media, where there's a lot of insinuations and allegations about, cover-up conspiracy that would include, the whole scientific community, which is, very hard to coordinate. Let's put it like this, because how can you get every virologist in the world involved in, nobody speaking out that this is an unnatural virus? There's, I don't know, 1 million virologists in the world, or maybe not 1 million, maybe 150,000. I don't know. You cannot, nobody's speaking out about this. It seems to be hard in every country around the world. What organization could even have this amount of pull on it? And it also doesn't reflect my own research into this topic, where many virologists were initially, when there was not a lot of data, were very suspicious about the origin, that wanted to investigate it, that thought the lab leak theory was very plausible. And so they started investigating. We're talking about the Mike Worobey, that was, very much after the WHO mission in 2021 to Wuhan, where they came out and said, it's most likely zoonotic, but we don't have proof. We cannot exclude the lab. He was like, okay, I want to investigate this deeper. And so he spawned this very famous science letter that also contributed then to this 2021, what I call the vibe shift in mainstream media, that people started taking it even more seriously than they were before. And he came out basically being one of the strongest proponents for the zoonotic theory, that the virus is a natural virus that jumped over from animals, because he tried to kind of disprove. In science, you usually try to disprove, right? And he tried to disprove the idea that the virus came from this wildlife market. And so, he kind of, in his basement, he tracked down the first 159 patients or whatever it was in December 2019. What was the history? How were they diagnosed? Which hospitals, did they go to and were diagnosed? When were they? Where did they live? And then, he thought maybe he could disprove this market link, that this was, by coincidence or an ascertainment bias, because, the authorities preferentially looked into this there. But in the end, none of this held up. And this market association holds very strongly epidemiologically, and what he could show also geographically. So the only people that were sick in Wuhan in 2019 were basically the people that were somehow epidemiologically associated with the market, meaning they were working there, they were shopping there, or they had some other contact directly with somebody that worked or shopped at the market. Or the second line, what he showed, is geographically. So nobody else in the city had, the virus except the people that were linked to the market or very close around the market, because the virus started spreading, community spread outward from the market. Wuhan is a big city, right? It's as big as the 5 boroughs of New York. and the lab is very far away, right? 30 minutes by car away, right? So you would assume that, if the virus was already widespread, you would see multiple pockets coming up all over the city, closely around the lab workers, whatever, but there were no early cases. There were nothing associated with that. And all the early cases, every patient, really falls into the category of either an epidemiological or a geographic association with the market. So this is a very strong indication that the market cannot easily be explained away. And then there were other scientists, Christian Anderson at first, with Eddie Holmes from Australia. The two of them reached out in early 2020 to the intelligence services, to the MI6, to the Australian intelligence services, to the FBI, because they were suspicious when nobody knew anything and conspiracy theories suggested this was a lab leak and a bioweapon. They were like, hey, could this be engineered? Did some sequence comparisons. They saw, there was a foreign cleavage site in there. There were some other hallmarks that looked a bit confusing at first. They're like, okay, we cannot exclude it. Let's convene and talk about it, right? And they ring the alarm. And then once they started investigating the story, they also came out on the other side, right? They said, look, now that we've got more evidence, it's very clear that there's recombination that caused some of these genetic pieces fall into place. Christian Anderson looked deeper into the Huanan market. He found inside the market that the animal stalls where the wild animals were kept had a higher viral positivity. So, you see that people were trying to challenge and disprove, came out on the other side. Sorry. So and this is a theme that repeats again and again. You can also take somebody like Flo de Bar, who had nothing to do in the early part. She was part of the French commission for, investigating the origin in 2020. She was very much pro-lab leak. She was, a big supporter of some of the contrarians that I outlined, like, Alina Chan, thinking, hey, we are scientists, we have to raise the question. It doesn't matter what the political implications are. This has to be investigated. And then when she did the work, she also came out very strongly on the side of a natural origin, basically, because all the threats that she followed up on from the supposed, evidence for lab leak, they all fell apart even under the mildest scrutiny. So you apply a little bit of scientific scrutiny to some of these talking points that the lab leak has, put out there, and they all fall apart very quickly. And then, of course, later she was also involved in some other primary research on including the Huanan market and what the genetics can tell us about the wild animals there and stuff like this. So this is kind of, the longer it goes on, and you cannot really blame people for the initial uncertainty, because outbreaks, there's a long tail of uncertainty. Many outbreaks in history have taken years to decades to figure out, what happened and where they came from. And this one, we had a lot of initial information, but then, that is not conclusive. You need more cooler heads to prevail, to do the scientific work, to, learn more about the virus, learn more about, what data is around and what it really tells us to really come to a conclusive answer. And in 2020, there was a lot of uncertainty, and this was closing. It was starting, I would say, with, a chance that this could have come from a lab, towards, all the explanations that people used to offer. And these are conspiracy theories, although the idea that it could have come from a lab is not necessarily conspiratorial. All the scenarios that people offered, from bioweapons to, snake DNA to secret gain-of-function research, would involve a huge cover-up conspiracy or secret military programs, some other kind of, conspiratorial elements. So this is why, the people always say, it was completely discarded as a conspiracy theory. No, that's not true. Some scenarios were discarded because they were clear conspiracy theories, but the idea was constantly investigated. Where does this virus come from? It was investigated rather unbiasedly. So it's not that the scientists met together and said, we're going to push a zoonotic origin. That's not the case. Many scientists came from different places. Some were more inclined to see this as natural. Some were more inclined to see it as a lab. They started converging around the evidence, and the evidence fell entirely on one side, and on one side only, which is that this is a natural origin. And there's multiple different lines of evidence. None of it is perfect, but in science, in these outbreak investigations, you will not have perfect evidence. We have this for no outbreak, but for the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak, the first outbreak in Wuhan, it's hard to think about any other outbreak where we have so much information. So it really shouldn't be a mystery anymore at this point, given how much different lines of evidence tell us the same story, that contribute to the same picture, that this is a natural virus that via the wildlife trade gained, the capabilities to cross-species adaptation. Some of it is already in bats. Some of it this respiratory adaptation likely came through the wildlife trade. And then, you give it the opportunity to spill over and over again from this risky animal-human interface in these wildlife markets that are not very sanitary, to really establish, in the end, we had two different lineages radiating outward from this market. So not even one, but multiple spillovers is the best explanation on how this could have happened. And the single introduction of a virus, somewhere along the wildlife chain or in a village, most of the time would die out. So there are simulations now that say, look, if it would have started in a village, not everybody that catches the virus would necessarily infect another one. They would not necessarily continue the chain. So, most of the time the virus would die out by itself. The only way how it could really cause a sustained human-to-human transmission was that you have a risky animal interface. You have multiple spillovers, at least two we know for sure because we have two different lineages, but scientists think it's probably more like in the range of 8 to 20 spillovers until, the virus could establish itself in the human population in Wuhan, a very dense population center in the winter, go unnoticed also because everybody has a bit of flu or some other viruses going on, and then really start taking the world from there. Yeah, this is kind of the evidence, and there's a lot of more detail, and I try not to. So in the book, right? I have an extra website that has 100 scientific references. I have other works that are referenced about reviews and so forth. But the book itself is not trying to be a scientific kind of this is all the evidence and all the papers and all the figures. The book is really the story of what happened to us during this pandemic with this controversy. And the science is kind of smuggled in because I know people wouldn't necessarily read a science book. So the science is only smuggled in the way of this is what the scientists did, this is what they discovered, this is why it matters. And not so much to lecture, but more like give people the necessary context to also explain then how absurd some of the allegation and the stories of the antagonists are. When you just learned that, this is, a critical piece of evidence for this virus not being artificially stitched together. And then you have, the antagonist explaining on the world stage to Congress or whatever, or to the Economist in this case, this is a virus that has, unnatural fingerprints of being a synthetic construct. So, this contrast is something I work a lot with in the book so that people just understand that the divergence between what the science and the science suggests and the scientific community kind of knows about this topic versus what society is being fed by these manipulators in between, the people that were kind of, abusing our information ecosystems, abusing, emotional takes, outrage and other mechanisms online to really push a completely different story from where the science actually went. And this is kind of the core theme of the book. Yeah.
No, that's great. You sort of mentioned that in chapter 7 as well, how bats and their virus function as nature's own gain of function laboratory, how their genetic mixing naturally produces complex virus. Yeah. So, and I think each chapter of your book covers, they are all interlinked, but they cover different topics, I guess. And then you try to bring all of them together in the last two chapters. But some of the actors spreading alternative narratives or false narratives were Dr. Meng and Dr. Eric Weinstein, obviously Steve Bannon as well, and there were a whole heap of others as well. Who was the first one? Was it Dr. Meng? Who was the first one?
So
who gained fame?
For the bioweapon story, this is actually quite well researched now, how it started and how it took off. So immediately when you had the outbreak in Wuhan, people in Hong Kong were very suspicious because there was the first SARS outbreak that had a huge impact on Hong Kong. And, we dodged a bullet that this didn't turn into a pandemic. And so the Hong Kong, and there was also at the time the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong versus the Chinese mainland. The UK had given back Hong Kong and the Chinese were encroaching more and more on the sovereignty of Hong Kong. So there was already a high suspicion and paranoia against the CCP. And then, when the virus comes, that suddenly forced the directorate in Hong Kong to, stop the pro-democracy protests because of lockdowns and, contact tracing, many activists. There were at some point, I think, 15 or 20% of the Hong Kong population demonstrating against, these new laws. And suddenly this all got shut down in 2020, this pro-democracy movement based on a new virus. There was a lot of anxiety and anger and suspicion that something is not natural about this virus, right? And in this context, you have to understand where Li Mengyang comes from. She was from mainland China. She came to Hong Kong. She had a change in information environment and, realized that, China has fed her, for most of her life, a very well-crafted alternative narrative of what reality is. So she already was very much leaning anti-CCP. Then she is in this, and then there was this mystery about where does this virus come from, and she started, getting into her own world and creating this idea that it might have been a bioweapon because there was this Chinese military academy that had collected two relatives, too far away to be of relevance, but at the time the only ones known. And so in her head, she connected this somehow and then started pushing this idea that this might have been a Chinese military thing. And immediately she got picked up by these manipulators in the West, by the operation from Miles Guo, which is this Chinese exile billionaire, the host between Getter, the sponsor between Getter and G News and others. And he worked closely with Bannon together since 2018 already. And they picked up on her. They brought her basically to the US. They bought her a first-class ticket. They paid for a media coach to really kind of craft her story and her suspicion in this Netflix drama, in this critical election in the US, that, you have now a Hong Kong whistleblower that really explains that this is a bioweapon. And this, she exploded on the scene, and, she had millions of views with Tucker Carlson and, Fox News and One American Network and Bannon's War Room podcast. So this is very well established nowadays that she was among the first. But at the same time, you had different people, right? There's a QAnon conspiracy theorist called Jordan Sadler or something, that he pushed the idea about the Bill Gates and 5G. If this conspiracy theory rings a bell with you, he was the first one that basically, he picked up from his conspiratorial community that there was a patent for a SARS related vaccine, right? This was for the first SARS virus. So people, after SARS broke out, people were investigating, some were applying for a patent for the first SARS virus, right? And he didn't understand that SARS-CoV-2 is a different virus than SARS-CoV-1. And then he just looked at, the patent application for SARS-1 is running out. So of course they release a virus now in order to make money. This was this idea. And this kind of morphed into a few months later into the idea of the pandemic, that the whole thing was just planned to force, vaccines into people. There were, AIDS denialists and other conspiracy theorists that had this big documentary called Pandemic. And this all goes back to this kind of QAnon conspiratorial community. Vaccines they merged and created kind of more and more content on this idea of pandemic, of Bill Gates, 5G, and whatever it might be. So there's a different story happened in parallel, right? Unresponsive to the bioweapon narrative. Then you had the Russians. The Russians had another classical disinformation campaign. So in the 80s, the Russians pushed the idea that HIV was created by the CIA. So now with the new virus outbreak, they thought they can do it again, blaming the US again for a new virus creation. So they had this kind of figure, Igor Nikolin or something, that portrayed himself as this bioweapon expert, and that basically pushed the idea that it came from out of US biotechnology. That would also be, picked up by media. That was blasted out by Russia Today, and some people in the West picked it up as well. So you see, there's multiple different pots, and you could drill down on some of these. You can never do all of them because most of them arise organically, and the ones that perform best in audience demand, or where that have a very charismatic influencer pushing them, they are usually the one that rise to the top and then get weaponized and used for further myth making and to further the agenda of the people involved. There's another story about the Daily Mail. So the British tabloids were also involved. The Murdoch media empire was also involved in spreading rumors. So they were more based on sensationalism and rumors about the idea that people warned about the biosafety lab in Wuhan and now see something happen. There's all this story about they had poor biosafety. It's just, the virus must have escaped from the BSL-4 lab because, the Chinese don't know how to handle biosecurity, blah, blah, blah. There were stories about Canadian spies that, kind of brought the virus from Canada to to China, and they created it in their lab, and then it leaked for the lab because of poor biosecurity. This is all the stories that, the sensationalist tabloids picked up. So you have multiple different layers to this, and at some point you see also they started converging, in different aspects of, one story element from here, one from here gets picked up and repackaged. And then you have another storyteller or another politician or whatever it is to kind of, further it and try to ride this horse for personal gain, whatever it might be, political, ideological, popularity, and so forth. And this is what the book outlines. So it's although we work strongly with anecdotes, and some of these anecdotes are there, it's really just to exemplify, how modern disinformation campaigns work, how the rumor mill works and spreads into weaponized narratives, and overall how our modern information ecosystem has become very exploitable and very vulnerable to these kind of actors and actions and agendas. And I think this is kind of the meta story behind the book that is still applicable today more than ever, I would say, given how, strong the anti-reality coalition in the US and elsewhere is gaining political ground. And so this, I think this is kind of what I try to also bring into this book. And this is why it was very complex also to get the book sold with book agents, because, it has science, it has disinformation, it has primary testimony, it has a meta-narrative, it has psychology, cognitive behavioral psychology. So it has a lot of different aspects that I try to package in one comprehensive novel-like story, right? The whole thing is a narrative, non-fiction narrative told extremely factual, extremely accurate, but still told like you would read a novel. And I think this is why it resonates with the people that read it, because, it's not boring. You can read it and people enjoy just, oh, this is super interesting, because, it's not like a lecture. It's really about, oh, what's happened next, or what did they do here? And oh my God, what does it mean for us in the future if this continues to happen?
So these narratives, I think, in my opinion, caused two outcomes. One, obviously, confusion among general public, and the second one was maybe hindering the actual scientific research. And you talk about it in your probably chapter 11 or 12, how Dr. Supapon was now not being allowed to hunt for viruses as well in Thailand, because I think there's no more funding, or the funding has been slashed, I guess. So I think, and then that second outcome is much more dangerous, because once you stop scientific rigor and scientific research, then things become really complicated, because you don't really have an actual evidence-based narrative to counter the confusion, I guess. It also propelled all these people to fame, because I know I started seeing Dr. Lee Meng quite a bit in my YouTube feed. She was everywhere. She was obviously Tucker Carlson, Fox News. She was also in India as well, because everything that China does, if it's wrong, India is going to pick up. Yes. And obviously Russia as well. So yeah, she was everywhere. So I was thinking, in just a span of 1 or 2 weeks, I was thinking, why am I seeing this person? And she's a doctor, so obviously general public would think that whatever she's saying is must be true. But I think, like you mentioned in your book, science works at a very slow pace, much slower than the imagination. And I think, do you think it's because China couldn't come up with a proper narrative in time, and they censored the information early on, because they were also struggling to understand where did this virus come from, and that might have given flame to all these air to all these flames, and that's how these narratives were able to spread so quickly as well, because there was no counter narrative in the beginning.
I think every pandemic is followed by conspiracy theories. I think irrespective of what China would have done, the trauma and the impact of the pandemic would have been so strong that it wouldn't have really mattered. If it wouldn't be these actors, it would be somebody else. I think it's a feature of the information ecosystem much more than of who has been the individual actors and their failings. And that's why I get a bit frustrated when people said, if the scientists had communicated just, 10% better, or, if Fauci hadn't said this about face mask, public trust and whatever would have been completely fine. And I think this is completely false, because, there's so much more going on that people were not aware, that, also the fragmentation of our information ecosystem means that, people receive very different informations, and never unfiltered, always filtered by this new class of what René DeResta calls hidden shapers, which is algorithms, influencers, and activist crowds. So I would say, yes, it would have helped always if you had more transparency in China. Would have had made much of a difference. I don't think we can rerun the experiment, but I'm skeptical, I would say. Let me just flesh out a little bit what I think the Chinese were trying to do and what didn't work out well for them. So you have to think in 2019, in December, when the first people started getting sick, in the very last days of December, I think the the rumors were around the 27th of December is when, there was a couple of cases of pneumonia of unknown origin that multiple hospitals picked up. One of these hospitals had sent it to a sequencing company, and the analyst in the sequencing company kind of got an alarm for, disaster-like sequences for some of these probes that they got, right? So she, her handle is called a little blue mountain dog or something like this in Chinese characters. She kind of was the first one to really identify and sequence the new virus. Before then, 2 weeks later, 3 Chinese labs, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Shousheng's lab he was in, oh God, where was he now? He was in a different city, but he had still good contacts to the health authorities because he was working for the health authorities, and then the health authorities themselves in China, they all sequenced it. But that doesn't mean that the rumors didn't spread very fast. So when it turned out that the doctors identified what looked like another outbreak of SARS, they didn't know it was a new virus. It just for them looked like another outbreak of SARS. These rumors started spreading the last few days in Wuhan, China, through the city, through, informal channels, through social media and others. And then, by the time the Chinese, health authorities, the Wuhan health authorities, I have to say, came to shut down the market, the animals were already gone because, people probably heard that there's another SARS outbreak. Let's hush it up. Let's try, this is how Chinese society works, right? You don't necessarily have, everything controlled by the CCP from the top level, but you have each layer of society tries to kind of not stick out, to not get into trouble, to not cause problems. And so you have multiple layers from local people, vendors that, the animals they didn't have the right permissions to have them, right? We have fines from them, from the Wildlife Bureau from, December 2019 that fined the owners of some of these animal stores inside the Huanan market for kind of selling wildlife that didn't have the right permissions to sell, right? So it's clear that, if the rumors circulated to them saying there's another SARS outbreak, hush, hush, get rid of the animals, they tried to, as self-preservation, to get rid of them, right? Then there was other stories about the owner of the Huanan market, which is also somehow involved shadily with politics and what a colleague of mine called the Red and Black Alliance in China. So the red one is the Communist Party, so the politicians that look the other way. For the black one, the black market, the triads and so on, they have kind of this arrangement that, we look the other way and you do your business and we get a cut, right? And so the Huanan market owner is somewhat involved in that, and nobody really ever was allowed to follow up on this. So this was already, a very difficult environment for the health authority to investigate with somebody that is kind of connected to a cousin of Xi Jinping himself, right? Which is the owner. And apparently they pre-warned the owner of the market to also, clear out because the health authorities are going to come the next day. So they had and this is, I heard from different sources, nobody could tell me, concretely what happened, but many suspected that, the owner of the Huanan market was informed that there will be kind of the health authorities cracking down on his market. So he told the vendors to also clear out whatever they had. So this is what happened first. And then you had the local authorities that, didn't want to kind of admit that they had this outbreak on their hands that they couldn't handle. So they tried to control the narrative and kind of downplay it and keep it locked up before it started to overwhelm them, right? And so when the Chinese CDC. So China has different CDCs. They have local CDCs, then kind of, and then the federal CDC in that case. And so the local and the federal were not always exchanging all the information as well. Another layer of obfuscation that comes in where the local ones try to protect their asses, right? Before the federal authorities come and, crack down on them. So they were trying to keep it down. They were trying to, get it handled before it escalated worse, right? And then the same for the national CDC, which is, under the control of the Health Bureau, which is a political organization. They also wanted to get, and this is what George Govt, the head of the CDC at the time of the federal one, told me, they wanted a chance to get the pandemic or the outbreak done before, signaling widely there's human-to-human spread. So they had every hope that they could take care of this outbreak kind of locally and quietly before it kind of, became a huge political issue on the global stage for the party. And if you understand a little bit about the Chinese culture and how they think, and, better to not say anything, better to be quiet and remain face and blah, 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 then, this whole idea of, and the muscle they put on scientists, don't say anything to the press yet. Let us try to get it done. This contextualizes a little bit their response more, and why there was this mantle of silence in my book. I write, they tried to kind of, put the mantle of silence away, but ultimately what it would end up is fan the flames of suspicions, not only in the Western world, but also inside of China. I mean, people, of course, also in China wanted to have better answers. And the Chinese then themselves, they were also not, there are different layers. So the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right, that this could have caused the virus. This was something that is also, Xi Jinping herself, so the bad woman herself, she was suspicious because when she heard about, the rumors and new SARS case, a hospital contacted her institute and asking her to basically, we have suspicion SARS. We have 9 patients. Can you sequence this sample and tell us if it's SARS? And so she was kind of away, and then she asked her students, please stay over the night and sequence the sample. She traveled by train back, and she learned. And then she was very nervous because, didn't know what the sequence would contain. She didn't get the full sequencing for half a day or so. And she thought, could it be one of our viruses? Turns out, okay, the virus is too distant to anything they had at the time. It was not SARS, but it also was not something that they ever sampled. So she was more relieved in that sense that it wasn't her. But that doesn't mean that, people never looked after. So there were 2 independent, or not independent, but outside investigations into her own lab by the Wuhan Institute of Virology herself, which, Xi Jinping herself is not part of the Communist Party, but the head of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, she's a Communist Party member, right? And so they did an internal investigation first into her, were the people sick? What were they doing? What are the lab protocols, electronic records, right? And the same happened then for the federal authorities that also wanted to look into the lab, because clearly they were worried that it could have come from the lab, right? And then in the end, it didn't come from the lab. Xi Jinping has not been treated by the authorities anymore as under suspicion, but then also they didn't admit necessarily that, they were worried about it coming from the lab, because, politically that wouldn't play well on the global stage. If they had reason to worry, they believed then, it's better to not say anything. So they never said that they investigated it properly. This again fueled more suspicion. Is why was there never an investigation into the lab? And by the time the WHO mission came in 2021, everything was already polarized, and the Chinese authorities, they had been coming under pressure, especially from the Trump administration. They were talking about, China has to pay reparations to the world, blah, blah, blah. So they were already blocking and saying, okay, now we need a narrative that says the virus didn't start in China. It came from anywhere else. John Cohen has a very nice article in Science about it called, Anywhere But Here. So this became the official strategy of China in around July 2020. And then, the bioweapon suspicion really worked in their favor by saying, there was the military games. You brought it from Fort Detrick. The Chinese don't make propaganda for us. They make propaganda for their own population, because, the regime has a difficult time during this crisis to maintain control over the population, because any crisis could potentially lead to sparks of change. And so what they needed was, their own propaganda to reflect what resonates with Chinese people. And what reflects for them is like, we are the first victims. The virus came from outside. Maybe the Americans did it, victimization by the West. And now they blame us for it, although we are innocent. So this is the propaganda that the Chinese authorities pushed, and that still most Chinese believe. They did, and this is kind of a Western creation. The Chinese never admitted it coming from the wildlife market. They never pushed it coming from the wildlife market. In fact, they tried to suppress any kind of mention that it could have come from the wildlife market or from China. And so this idea that, because the Chinese are not transparent, that means it was a lab leak is completely, people have completed the wrong way around. They suppress any narrative that it could come from China. And it's more embarrassing to a certain extent if it would have come from the wildlife market, because after SARS-1, they promised to clear up the act. They tried to portray themselves as this modern, technological, superior culture, and having, this wildlife trade, this practices, this cultural practices, very embarrassing for them. So they have a lot more worry about the wildlife market. And we see again and again, every time we have documentations of where the Chinese authorities lied, for example, to the WHO mission, they said there were no wildlife mammals at the market because it would have been illegal. And then, you have studies from Chinese authors that say, oh, sorry, we found, 50,000 animals in the last 2 years that went over these markets. You have, environmental samples that show clearly the animals were there. So this did not fly well. And this kind of proves that the authorities really tried to cover up the market link and the market origin. They kind of muffled their own bad researchers to not look for SARS-related coronaviruses in Chinese bats, because they worried that, just admitting that Chinese bats have SARS-CoV-2 related viruses would, be a step closer to blaming them to be responsible for the pandemic from it having coming out of China and so forth. So, and for the lab leak, they don't do that. They don't care what the Westerners say about the lab leak, mostly. Right? They don't suppress information about it. They use it as an example of, crazy Westerners talk about bioweapons. This is so absurd. This is so unfair. And then they reflect it back. So, I'm not a China expert, I have to say. I can only speculate on some of these motivations. I try to get, independent journalists that are in China, and other independent sources from China. And I was somewhat successful to getting some of those to give me a bit of a lay of the land there. But the book overall doesn't rest on it. It doesn't have to rely on, what Chinese did or didn't do or say or didn't say, because luckily enough, we get enough independently verified evidence to clearly point to a natural origin of this virus. But just to some of the background, and I feel like it's so frustrating when, so much supposedly investigative work from journalists in the West went into investigating, virologists in the West and, Diffuse and EcoHealth Alliance, and no interest at all in following up. Who's the owner of the wildlife market? How was he involved? Why did the animals disappear from the market when the Chinese CDC came? Where did the animals go? These are basic outbreak-related questions that should have been followed up, that never were followed up. That scientists, by themselves might not be able to follow up necessarily, but journalists, investigative journalists, they should have, and they didn't do that. So there is also a clear bias in what narrative journalists wanted to uncover versus, what they didn't follow up upon. And there were some, I'm not saying there's nobody, there were some. There's a Drake Kang from the Associated Press. There's a Michael Standard. He was a China editor, I think, for The Economist at some point, that contributed some of our knowledge by doing this investigative journalism. There's Chen Xiu, which also was part of the documentary movement, that also kind of followed up with Xi Zhengli and what they did. So there's some journalistic work, but no comparison to what people tried to kind of uncover in the West by, blaming virologists in the West that clearly had nothing to do with this outbreak. There's no connection to that at all. And it's just, they make much more convenient scapegoat to a domestic audience and to this anti-science movement that took hold in the US. And we see this now with, RFK Jr., with Jay Bhattacharya, the head of the NIH, and RFK is the head of the Health and Human Services. All of them, the head of the FDA, Makary, he just said, COVID was a lab leak. So was Lyme disease, came from bioweapons. So was, HIV. So, all these conspiratorial activists, all these crazy people are now in power and in control of the public health and science in general in the US to dismantle and destroy it. So this is also what I outlined a bit in the last chapter, the repercussions of having such an emotional, very strong narrative that can be used again and again and again to discredit science and scientists, and to really justify a lot of what we are seeing today, which is, of course, the dismantling of science to not interfere with political narratives and with what I would describe as a fascist kind of movement in the US, where they really didn't want any democratic lever against power. And this brings me back to the very first thing, which is that, like, the moment scientists are shut up, science is dismantled, the moment we take away our chance to have somebody find facts, create evidence, then what are we talking about? Then it's really all back to power and those who have power to further their narratives. And I hoped we had left this time behind. I thought, time of the Renaissance, and brought back a bit more of an evidence-based thinking, and that evidence should ultimately decide and navigate our informational conflicts between what is more likely to be true or false. And we are seeing a reversion, a kind of a return to the dark age, where our means of producing evidence and also the dissemination of factual evidence gets sabotaged or subverted or corrupted or stopped. And now it's all about opinions. It's all about who has the power and the amplification to get their story and their ideas into the world. And I think this is a very dangerous road for democratic societies all around the world to go down this road.
So this one on wildlife market, is this where they sell, or they used to sell animals as pets to people? Was that the main
in Chinese wildlife
market?
markets? So there's many different types of wildlife market. The pet selling is not one of them in the Chinese wildlife markets. It's really more like for, I think it's called Huawei or something like this. It's really like for eating. It's really like for consumption, wildlife. There's wildlife trade also, when we talk about fur trading. In China, there's huge raccoon dog farms in northern China that breed as very specific, millions of raccoon dogs for their fur. And then, they get skinned alive sometimes. But what we talk about in the Huanan market, this was not only a wildlife market, was a huge market also for, frozen fish and other seafood. But also, of course, what's considered delicacies in China, some of these more exotic animals that people like to consume, because in Chinese traditional medicine, they either believe that specific organs of these wild animals are effective against diseases, or, strengthen your body or do different things, right? I mean, pangolin, one of the most wildlife traded animal in the world, pangolins, they want the scales of those animals for multiple purposes in Chinese medicine. So it's another reason for the wildlife trade. And then also the meat and whatever goes into sometimes medicine, sometimes delicacy consumptions. Yeah.
So what's the general consensus now among scientific community? Has everybody accepted in the scientific community that the virus originated from Huanan market?
So this is a very interesting question, because this is not how science works. So consensus is not really something that science, this is something we have a consensus on climate science. And this is really when people start to organize to communicate a very strong kind of, for the public or for political reasons, scientists kind of coordinate to have these committees on consensus, and then they make formal consensus statements. The IPCC for climate does this. This is something that usually happens a lot later, and only when somebody is motivated to do so. Scientists themselves base, there's different ways to think about consensus. One is about, what does the majority of scientists believe? And the other is, what is the body of knowledge, the body of evidence suggesting to be the consensus? And most scientists kind of work on the consensus of evidence. So all lines of evidence suggest the consensus, and this is what we stick by, while keeping the mind open for new evidence to come in to change our mind if need be. And the funny part is that the evidence of the consensus-based evidence usually precedes the more political, scientific kind of consensus statement and evidence by, sometimes decades. So when we talk about climate, some people investigated when did the first consensus on climate change emerge. And they found that, it was, I think, 9 or 10 years before the first formal conferences trying to figure out the consensus on climate, the evidence basis was already a consensus. And I think we are at this point now here for the zoonotic origin, that when people look at the evidence, the consensus from the scientific evidence is very strong, but it doesn't mean that scientists came around and organized conferences to make consensus statements about it. That being said, we have some informal surveys conducted. Some of them, I think the first one was end of 2024, that kind of gave a lay of the land. What I think from polling 320 public health scientists, virologists, epidemiologists, and they lean very strongly for a zoonotic natural origin. So with, I would say, over 80% favoring this explanation. And then you have some outliers that, either didn't make up their mind or have not looked deeply into the evidence. So I think it will come, it will get stronger. The consent, I mean, it's a slow process. Like I said, everything in science is a slow process. And if people, and this is a good trait of scientists, right? If they have not looked into the evidence themselves, they would be very hesitant to say, I'm very strong zoonosis if I have not done the work, if I have not read the literature. So many of them say, okay, it's a possibility. That's the last stand of what I know. We cannot exclude it. So we still keep the door open. And this is also what you see reflected in the SEGO, which is a WHO, World Health Organization based commission, that also said, look, all the evidence we looked at points to a zoonotic origin, but that doesn't mean there couldn't be more evidence coming. China has also not been super transparent, so we keep other scenarios potentially open. I'm not the type of person. I'm the person that thinks that I go to the experts that really did their primary work. I try to understand what is the consensus from the evidence that arises out of the evidence, and then I draw my conclusions. And, although a lab origin cannot 100% be disproven at this point, and, proving a negative is anyway difficult in science, I would say the odds that the scientific kind of consensus or the weight of the evidence will change on this topic is very low. And, I sometimes give a number like, maybe 1 in 50,000, 1 in 100,000, that this would change. And I think this is I would stick by that. So it's very unlikely that the scientific, because we already uncovered so much evidence that people are not aware about, it's very unlikely that any type of lab scenario can explain the evidence we do already have. So it's not the question of, we are just missing so much, and that's why everything is possible. It's more like, how can any other scenario but the natural origin explain the evidence we do already have? And I think this is very much, this is closed now. I would say there's very few explanation possible about any kind of research involved in it. And then we are certainly not talking about gain of function research and engineering. Then we're talking about a freak, unknown infection from a bat. Researcher sampled in the wild, somehow brought it, to Wuhan, maybe interacted with a wildlife animal and brought it to the animals that way. And that's how basically it's indistinguishable from a natural origin, but somehow a researcher was involved, right? This is a 1 in a million chance or whatever, but this you cannot disprove because it's, it would create the same evidence we have, but we are far away from any type of lab accident then there, because a lab accident, very hard to explain, because the lab couldn't have necessarily gotten this virus. It certainly couldn't have created it. It most likely would not have found it in bats, because the virus that spilled over was not a bat virus anymore. It has mutated through the animal population in the wildlife to gain more respiratory adaptations. And it couldn't have been the same virus in bats. So you will not find a 1-to-1 virus in bats. The last few percent, and this is the same for SARS-1, by the way. This is what Shengli Shi also told me. Like, she never found a closer virus to SARS-1 in the wild than 96.5%. Because also SARS-1, there's a precedent. It spilled to civet cats and raccoon dogs, and via the wildlife trade then went to another city that was 600 miles away from where these viruses are, in Yunnan, to a city close to Hong Kong where it spilled over, right? So the lab couldn't have necessarily found SARS-CoV-2 in bats, so any type of accidental lab accident nobody knew about is very unlikely. And secondly, all the evidence we have about the Huanan market and nothing around the lab also make it very hard to think that if the virus indeed escaped from a lab, why does all the evidence, all the patterns that, people looked into with high confidence now point to this market away? Did the lab researchers by chance just, were super infectious to go to the market and infect people in the market, but nobody else in the environment, in the lab or around the lab? And then this must have happened more than once, because we talked about multiple spillovers, about different lines spreading outward. So you wouldn't have different lines in the lab. So why would they have different lines in the lab, different lab researchers, both of them going to the Huanan market, both not infecting anybody, but only in this market suddenly it spreads out from there twice? It's hard, it strains credibility. So this is my take on it. I'm sure there are some scientists that are more careful, and they're right, and they should be more careful in saying, look, we are scientists, we keep an open mind. If there were ever some evidence to arise that could challenge our assumptions, we should keep an open mind. But this is also to their detriment, because then if scientists on the one side always say, look, all the evidence points one direction, but we keep an open mind, it's not very convincing to the general public. It's not very, people always hear, okay, it's still a possibility. And then the other side is very strong, saying, they covered everything up, blah, blah, blah. It's 100% like this. So people get a very contorted view of what actually is the scientific consensus on the one hand, and the evidence basis for it on the other. And so I'm not doing that. I'm saying, look, this is, I have a background in molecular biology. I worked with viruses in BSL2 before. This is my breakdown of it. I don't see any way how this could have happened anymore, given all the evidence that I know about and that has been firmly established. If you want to play the 1 in a million odds, that's fine. I'm not saying, don't, or, I think primary scientists should keep an open mind. But as a communicator, I have to reflect the reality. And the reality is that this was a natural virus, and certainly not a lab construct, and certainly not something that somehow escaped from a lab. So this is what I'm doing.
So then we have Brett Weinstein. He's an evolutionary biologist, obviously a scientist. Although studying virus or virology is not his field, but he's been pushing for a lab origin theory strongly. But he hasn't really published any peer-reviewed article to support his theory. And there are many scientists as well who haven't really published any peer-reviewed article pushing that or arguing for their lab-like origin theory.
Yeah.
Again, they're getting their credibility, they're getting their fame from social media, because obviously it's very easy to point out flaws in government and in science, and then be a contrarian, and then easily get followers as well. But what's your take on actual scientists like Brett Weinstein? They have scientific background, who push for these kind of narratives. Do they intentionally disregard all the data or all the latest scientific research?
So I think Brett Weinstein is, he only ever published, I think, 2 papers. He did a PhD, and after that, he was not really involved in science anymore. For me, it's not, credentials are not so important for me. I think they shouldn't be, because I think, the moment you stray away as a scientist from what the evidence suggests, the moment you move beyond what the evidence suggests, you stop being a scientist, no matter your credentials. So this is a bit how I see it. And yes, some of these credentialed people, they have either the training or the technical ability to understand not only the jargon, but also the arguments being put forward. And it's hard to not see how this is an intentional disregard of the available evidence in favor of a narrative that personally profits them. Brett Weinstein, of course, has been doing this for a long time on vaccines, on ivermectin, on other topics where, he was not susceptible to any type of evidence to change his mind. He doesn't change his mind because his mind is made up in whatever gains him the most attention, followers, emotional engagement, and ultimately this translates into influence and profit. More interesting are characters like Annalena Chan, who clearly, tries to understand the evidence or tries to argue evidence-based, but then still, comes into practices that are not, scientifically proper, like cherry picking, inflating uncertainty when it's not supposed to be, discrediting the scientists that did the work instead of criticizing the work itself. So this is more interesting psychologically, I feel like. How do people that maybe have a certain predisposition, how can they go down this path? And Alina Chan was much more reasonable in the early 2020, I would say, when she was still trying to do that towards what she's been doing more recently, right? Where she puts polls on Twitter asking, like, if this came from the lab, who is, most responsible to blame, right? So you see a transformation for many of these characters and these contrarians that maybe started out with genuine trying to understand or not being convinced by the available evidence. That's fair. I mean, you cannot like evidence. You cannot be convinced by it. You should have a certain amount of heterodoxy upfront, because that usually is what allows people to challenge and arrive at the same conclusion after, challenging the evidence from every angle possible. But this is not what these people have been doing for a long time. It kind of morphed into a discrediting of science, mainstream science, and really kind of, a fear mongering and the moral panicking about, gain of function research and, what virology has been up to all those years. And of course, then, once you, this is probably the more interesting part, how do people go down this road? What are the triggers and what are the rewards for doing so? And this is also what the book outlines a little bit, that, there is these aspects of, once you gain prominence, when you're an influencer for a certain narrative, it's very hard for you to change your mind. In science, usually we reward people that change their mind with evidence, that challenge the mainstream narrative. In public life, we don't do so because, admitting that you were wrong, that you made mistake, or that you misled people, it's very hard for public personas, for politicians, for influencers to do so, because then they would lose the followers that still want to believe. And so for them, it turns into what I call the marketplace of motivated rationalizations. So they start to rationalize, their actions and their behavior, and why they still kind of keep sticking with something that has been at this point strongly refuted or debunked. Why do they keep sticking with these stories? And this has everything to do with parasocial effects, with personal motivations, and not so much to do with science anymore. And this just shows that scientists are humans ultimately, and we are susceptible to all kinds of influences. And scientists are not these unique bastions of rationality. There's the sociology of science. There's a lot of humans doing the work, and the moment we kind of stray away from treating evidence as king and let other motivations influence our thinking and our behavior, ultimately we stray away from what is supported by the evidence and what is ultimately the reality and the truth. And I think we see this again and again, that people that gain prominence from being a contrarian on the lab leak story, they, in the beginning, they might have raised valid concerns, or they were playing the so-called God of the gaps argument, saying, we don't know, it could be, nobody knows, so let's keep investigating. Most of them started kind of innocently enough with this. Over the years, they turned into full rank conspiracy theorists, conspiracy peddlers, even like, influencers that are kind of are weaponized then by politicians to play their part in discrediting science and dismantling the institutions. I mean, Richard E. Bright comes to mind, somebody who, always had a bit of an axe to grind with virology, who was suspicious about the lab, who was asking in the beginning reasonable questions about, could this have come from the lab? Do we know? And very quickly, jumped on this idea that, actually it's the virologist doing this dangerous gain of function research, and, in the end gave testimony and media profiles, always repeating, at this point, very baseless accusations and insinuations and insults that are by far not supported by the evidence anymore, that are already contradicted by the evidence. And he just gained in prominence, and he gained more followers, and he gained more profile. I mean, he was at some point working closely with Rand Paul, the Republican politician, senator, to kind of, go against Anthony Fauci, right? And, part of documentary movies and God knows what. He still somewhat a media figure, and I think this got to his head. And previously he had a decent career in microbiology, so not in virology, but in working with bacteria, and he was publishing papers. And how could a person that should have been an established scientist get led astray? It's because we are not above the fray as being humans. We all, over time, we get influenced by our environment. We get influenced by our own motivations. We get influenced by parasocial relationship that these social media dynamics foster upon us. Yeah.
So then on the other side, not on the other side, on the same side, but slightly taking a different position, you've got people like Nicholas Wade who cherry pick data. They still look at the data, but they cherry pick data to support their own lab-like origin. And they're very influential as well. So obviously people read their articles also, and they get influenced by that as well, despite all the data being presented to them. But in one of your chapters, I think it's chapter 7, you talk about why it is so difficult to make this SARS-CoV-2 virus in lab. You talk about something of recombinant virus. Can you talk about it a bit? Yes.
So thank you very much for this question. It's a very for me, this is like the light bulb moment, because I was not, it was not on the front of my mind in the beginning to think about recombination. And recombination means that, viruses, sometimes when two viruses infect the same cell, they can change genetic elements. And so the offspring virus that gets produced by the cell kind of can have chunks of two different viruses. So you have so-called parental strains and then kind of the offspring, right? It's a very improper analogy, but sometimes I call it virus sex. So it's basically when viruses have sex, they can create offspring that has a little bit of both parents. Nothing to do with sexual reproduction, and don't use it. But for me, I feel like it helps explaining this. And the interesting part is that when we look at SARS-CoV-2, we see, that it's not just one segment, but it has like 27 different segments, because the evolution of coronavirus in the wild, because they are in millions of bats and the bats interact and, different virus strains interact. It's kind of a cauldron of genetic elements that mixes and mingles and, creates all this unique offspring. And like almost exclusively, all of this offspring would not be functional, because if you mix random genetic elements, you don't get a productive virus. But, once in a while, once in a million or once in a billion, you get a virus that's a bit better than the parental strain and starts outcompeting it. And this is what we see in coronavirus evolution, that it's very strongly shaped by this recombination, that all the coronaviruses, all the SARS-1 and SARS-CoV-2 related coronaviruses are recombinant viruses that have, when you look back in their viral history, they come from many different parental strains, like 20 or 30 or something like this, right? And this is super interesting when you then hear about, genetic engineers might have created this virus from a single parent, because you look at the whole genome, like in humans, right? We can look at the genome of us, and then we get, like ancestry of, we have so much of, Australian ancestry or Austrian ancestry or whatever. So much from the parent side and so ever. The same you can do with viruses, to think that you can kind of reconstruct the family tree of those viruses. And then you find that the closest segments, always have kind of a correspondent of a naturally found virus in the wild, and not a lab construct. So when you have something like RTG13 that differs from SARS-CoV-2 in like 1,200 base pairs, and all the changes that you have between these viruses are exactly the ancestral version of that mutation from a different parent, then it's clear that it's not the scientist that randomly mutated, the virus 1,200 times and always hit the right mutation as the ancestry that wasn't even known at the time, because people haven't tampered that much. It's clear that this virus must have come from nature, because we see the family tree there. We see the evolutionary history in this genome, and this goes back 40 years, and the virus SARS-CoV-2 came together only the last few, and then via recombination. And so this argument is just a really, really strong and potent argument. If you really understand it, although it's a bit technical, unfortunately, but if you really understand it, it's a really strong argument that no scientist could have created this virus in the lab, because we didn't have all the pieces. We don't know all the parents. We don't know all the genomes. So, the idea that we kind of, splice it together and create exactly this construct that we observe is impossible to do in a lab. It's impossible. because we haven't even found all the right parents in the wild. We have found, close relatives like the uncles and whatever in the wild to make sure that, this is a different lineage than this and there's a lineage in it. But ultimately, nobody has found, the closest parents for all the pieces. So it would have been impossible to stitch together artificially via genetic engineering. So this kind of really strongly kind of first speaks for a natural evolution because it's written in the genome, and contradicts kind of any type of genetic engineering scenario that they created the virus somehow from scratch. So this is kind of the argument I tried to make, and this is really hard and unintuitive to understand unless you go into one of these caves in Thailand like we did. And so I wanted to give people a bit of a perspective, and you stand there and you have like millions upon millions of bats on top of you, and they mingle, and you have pictures of bats that different species of bats mingle, and then you sample them, and some of them have viruses. Most of them are viruses we have never seen before, because you cannot sample, every bat in every cave when there's like, millions of caves and billions or more of bats in Southeast Asia and China alone. So it just gives a bit of a feeling of the size of nature and the vastness, and what I call nature's natural gain of function laboratory, because this is how new viruses really come out there, right? Nature experiments on them every day, creating millions of new variants. And sometimes, if the right genetic elements are around, and Cheng Li and others have shown that, the key to human infection, this the RBD that can infect ACE2 of mammals, the bats have it in their circulation, and for multiple bat species, because bats have very diverse ACE2, and sometimes evolutionary pressure forces them to have very broad binding capability to ACE2, and the broader the binding capability, the more likely it is that it's not only infecting other bat species but other mammal species, including pangolins, deer, humans, whatever it might be. And this is also again explained by evolutionary processes in bats way better than what we could have ever hoped to create in a lab at this point in time. Yeah, and certainly in 2019. Yeah.
And I think you mentioned that that's probably a missing piece from the public information, because that's something many people fail to recognize, that this is really difficult to create in a lab. And this happens almost entirely in nature, I guess.
I mean, sorry to just interrupt here. If you ask the virologist, could SARS-CoV-2 have been created conceivably by any laboratory experiment or whatever, or program in the lab, I think most will say it's impossible, and others will say it's certainly not possible by any normal laboratory procedure. Because then, if you really wanted to create a virus like this, you have to kind of recreate the scenario of how it likely emerged, which is basically you have to kind of recreate something like, serial passage experiments via different species like we have in the wildlife trade, right? If you recreate this scenario in the lab, maybe you can get something close to SARS-CoV-2 again that has, this respiratory adaptation. But ad hoc, with the knowledge we have, we wouldn't have been able, and everybody agrees we wouldn't have been able to create SARS-CoV-2. And no experiment, no simple experiment or research program, it's like, could have recreated this, right? So then if you suggest that this virus was somehow coming from a lab and being created in a lab, people don't understand what they're actually insinuating. They're insinuating like a secret military program on the scale of, the Manhattan Project in that sense, right? So, well, for the atomic bomb in the US, right? You really, this is what they're kind of insinuating if they say, this was clearly created from gain of function or whatever. And sometimes they try to tone down and say, maybe they have found just the perfect virus that had basically all the pieces already, and then just it came to the lab and they added a furin cleavage site. So this is kind of some of these scenarios where they say, it could have happened. But to create the perfect virus and then introduce a furin cleavage site does not work in science, because of something that's called epistasis in the virus, right? If you introduce an element, you break something else in the virus usually. And the only way how it can work is if evolution kind of optimizes on multiple places at the same time. And this only works in live transmission experiments. And you cannot, because viruses are very complex, not only about its complex 3D structure, it interacts with another complex 3D tissue. And then, when you talk about respiratory, nobody knows yet how to do a respiratory virus. Nobody knows, because it's super complicated. How make you sure that the virus gets aerosolized and then, coughed out? We don't have the models for that. We cannot do that yet. Just to give a bit more ground there, because I asked these questions to the virologists, and multiple of them and different ones. And like I said, and he said we couldn't have done it. It's impossible to do. And if I challenge them, how would you do it if you were forced to do it? They say, okay, we have to try to recreate what most likely happened in nature to get close to it, and there's no guarantee. So yeah. Sorry to interject
that's
here.
good. That's good to know. That's good to know. And then you also talk about social media and how social media was exploited for clickbait, reason to get followers. But then you talk about Angie Rasmussen and people like her. She's a virologist. How she was able to effectively spread accurate information, and she's been very successful on Twitter or X. So there are stories like that as well. I mean, good positive stories also. But on the other side, we've got stories where people have been doxxed, scientists have been harassed, physically threatened as well, both from public and by government as well. So it's a very sad story, actually. But it goes to show how society functions. When there's a crisis, some people jump on the opportunity intentionally to spread misinformation to actually gain from it. And some people just like pointing fingers, I guess, at everybody. So that's how society.
That's very human. Yeah, it's a very human thing to do, right?
Yeah. So I'm thinking this pandemic is a case study of how society functions as well, I guess. Yeah, not just how a virus spreads, I guess. So you've talked about a number of scientists in this book. Were there any one or two scientists that stood out for you?
I mean, they all have amazing background stories. I mean, I like, because we're in Australia, I'm going to talk a bit about Eddie Holmes. Eddie Holmes has been, involved in almost everything. So it was fantastic because he was, working in 2014 already. He's a virologist. Let me back a little bit. He's like one of the key virologists in the world, I would say. He has won almost any award there is to win. I think he won a very prestigious Croonian medal from the British Society just recently. He won also in Australia, some awards. He has been like a staple in when it comes to virus emergence and understanding the virome in the world. He has huge projects about mapping what's the viral landscape, right? And he thought it would be nice to work on zoonotic viruses in China, in places where these viruses emerge, right? And so he started spinning up collaborations in China in, I think, 2012, 2014, with the public health people there. And they, and he visited China. They wanted to establish basically kind of an early warning system for new spillover potential. This was with his collaborator from Shanghai. It was Shanghai University or Public Health Institute. Now he was previously with the CDC, Chinese CDC, and they kind of visited there, and they had kind of two visions of where what to do for an early warning system. Eddie Holmes wanted to kind of establish kind of surveillance in animals in this wildlife markets and elsewhere, where people come in contact with animals and say, look, if we just survey the animals, we might see what viruses are circulating and if they pose a danger to humans. And Zhou Zhang was kind of the guy that wanted to say that the more human-centric vision was, okay, I want to capture new emerging viruses in this unknown pneumonia cases that every hospital sees basically during flu seasons. There will always be, a few cases that they don't know which virus caused it, right? And funnily enough, they visited Wuhan in 2014 and they went to the Huanan market as one of those places where, likely new viruses might spill over into humans and emerge, right? And so Eddie Holmes in 2014 took pictures of the Huanan market of the same stalls that would be later be implicated in the virus emergence of SARS-CoV-2. I mean, talk about a crazy coincidence in this world. This is as close as you can get, right, to this. And this is such a fantastic story. And then also what happened later is like, they didn't establish the animal surveillance because it's also trickier somehow. But what Zhou Zhang, his collaborator, established was a network of hospitals that would work to him and send him the samples of the first pneumonia cases that hospital get where they didn't identify it, and send it to his lab to sequencing. And lo and behold, when the first unknown pneumonia cases in Wuhan started, on the 2nd or 3rd of January, Zhou Zhang's lab already got the the samples from those patients, and his lab technician was working like 40 hours, on the go to sequence it. And ultimately, Sheng would be the first person in the world to publish the first genome of SARS-CoV-2 and make it available to the world, which was the 10th of January by then. So you see, the foresight of some of these people, knowing these are no viruses, setting up the network, and then, a new virus emerges, and then less than 2 weeks later, the world knows exactly the genome of this new virus. And then people could start working, Moderna and others started working on the mRNA vaccine, having the sequence and having all the previous knowledge about coronaviruses and how the spike protein is very important for, infections. And so all the vaccines go against the spike protein. So this is why the vaccine, the miracle of the pandemic, the vaccines could have been so fast, is because of scientists laying the groundwork, establishing the system for reporting, to getting the sequence information fast, for understanding, the basic virology of coronavirus, SARS-related coronaviruses, the importance of the spike protein. All this, these are stories that are not necessarily told, and you really get a view of, why things are happening the way they are, right? And then now conspiracy theorists that don't know all this background, that don't understand anything about what's going on, they basically turn it around and say, Eddie Holmes, he must be one of the key conspirators because he has been involved in this photo. How did he create this photo? That's too much of a coincidence. We cannot believe this was, random. It was a pandemic. They started it. Or the other way is like, he was involved in the Fauci teleconference, which was not organized by Fauci, but by Jeremy Farrar. But, in their case, Anthony Fauci is the super evil person, so it has to be his. Why was he involved in that? Maybe because he was collaborating with people in China. He got the first genome out. There's so much that, that looks suspicious when you understand what these people have been doing all their life, that makes a lot more sense in context. And this is also what I tried to outline in the book a little bit, that these people don't come from nowhere. I mean, a Christian Anderson, right? He has been working in Western Africa on Ebola, on Lassa fever, right? He knows there's a new outbreak. What you have to do, you have to get the sequences, you have to do sequence comparison. That's why he did the first sequence comparisons. That's why he raised the alarm first, because the first sequence comparisons looked all right. I mean, this is all kind of to say that scientific processes are sometimes so removed from society. And if we can bring them a bit closer, then a lot of these easy misperceptions that conspiracy theorists exploits, these anomalies that they outline that are not anomalies, but just, ordinary procedures that are not necessarily accessible to society, it will get harder for them. And this is also part of my goal, to make it a bit harder for them to exploit people, but just equipping them with how does science work? What is the scientific process? What have these people been doing in their life? Just outlined. I mean, it's not long, but, just outlining a little bit where they come from and what they did already clears up automatically a lot of these misconceptions that the manipulators try to exploit and get people to emotionally invest. And then the sad part in our human nature is, once we are emotionally invested, once we have been convinced of somebody, it's very hard to change people's mind, because then we kind of internalize it, and then we start defending it because we emotionally accepted it as true. And although rationally it might not hold up, we still feel the need to defend it because it's become part of what we internalized. And this shouldn't be how science is, because, a lab origin doesn't have to be so polarized, because in the end, it's an idea that can be discussed rationally with facts. It's like, did it start from a lab? Did it start from a bat, right? Let's discuss what is pro, what is con, rationally about it. And by emotionalizing and politicizing this, the manipulators really did everybody a disservice, including people that bought into it, because then you cannot objectively look at it anymore. And I think many people just wanted a bit of a cleaner, objective answer to this that science couldn't provide in the moment. And so that void got filled by all these conspiracy theorists and people that were very confident. And now we are trying to reverse the damage done, which is very hard, because so many people kind of made peace with the idea that science and scientists were to blame, that we cannot trust them. So scientists are the wrong messengers to kind of, remedy this. So we would really need the help from public communicators, people with somebody like no stake in the game, that take another look at what does the evidence suggest, what did these people do, and what is the reality of it, just to correct the record and make sure that they cannot be exploited again and again as it currently is. The narrative, anytime, the NIH gets defunded, what was the reason? Because they did the lab leak in Wuhan, Fauci financed it, right? This was one of the two reasons given for why they need to historically defund the National Institute of Health in the US, causing enormous damage to not only the US and science supremacy in the US, but to the world. Making the world a lot less safe by, sabotaging scientific research all around the world. People going to the Amazon rainforest or to Western Africa, trying to prevent new outbreaks that would cascade into the world. They are defunded, they are sabotaged, their projects are gone. It's, we have not learned the lessons of this pandemic. We have kind of learned the wrong lessons, and we will be less prepared and more vulnerable for the next one. And so the first thing we have to fix is kind of, the informational landscape, that people understand what really happened, so that they can then also, act accordingly and, maybe elect politicians accordingly, not based on emotional trauma, but on based evidence. And yeah, that's my plea.
I have one last question. I've taken too much of your time, but
thank you so much.
You end your book by saying that it falls on, I've got it written over here, so I'll probably read it from here. It falls on all of us citizens to learn that we have to hold the line and stand up for an evidence-based democratic worldview. No cavalry is coming to magically rescue us from the encroaching darkness. We can't wait much longer on the sidelines either. So do you see much improvement in people understanding now that we are starting 2026 now? It's like 5 years have gone by.
You have to think, I wrote this line already way before, Trump won the election, and before the dismantling and the attack on the universities, the dismantling of science got really prominent in the US. So I wrote this like a year before, or even more than a year before. Something like this. And, everything I warned about, unfortunately, came true. And now I know this awareness, I think, is gathering steam. Some people are still flabbergasted and don't know what is happening. But I'm actually more focused now on what does it mean? What do we have to do next? And yes, this plea for an evidence-based worldview, I was thinking very carefully, what do I want to end the book on? Because, this is not about, necessarily correcting a moral injustice, what happened to the scientists, or correcting the record. This is all important, and this is part of what I'm doing. But ultimately, I want citizens to understand that science is the best we got to also protect ourselves from being manipulated. It's kind of a tool for accountability towards the elites and the powerful that push, their interests against the interests of society. Might it be public health, might it be finance or economics. If you have no scientists, if you have nobody creating carefully the evidence and the analysis of what this evidence tells us, we are just prey to the next charlatan that comes along with a story that emotionally resonates with us. And I don't want this to happen to us. I don't want to go back to the Dark Ages where, this was basically what the Dark Ages was, right? A rejection of rationality, a rejection of evidence in favor of some master narratives, might it be political or religious. And this is also what, the 19th or the 20th century, I have to say, was really about, which was about these grand myths about, the fascists. They all used these grand narratives and the grand myths where they said, it's about, the Nazis, about the supremacy of the German people, and, using, stories about why they are supreme, and at the same time, dismantling, any kind of evidence-based discourse and their own societies. Germany was the world leader in science before the fascists took over, and now it's largely diminished, right? US was a leader in science, and now, unfortunately, we see a bit of a repeat of history, although hopefully we can still stop it, and, the American people will stop it with the help of, everybody else, every other democratic citizens around the world. But we see something very similar. We saw this in the Soviet Union, Lysenkoism, where, the moment the politicians, the great myth makers, discard, media, journalism, education, and science. These are kind of the trifecta of what they want to do. And this is what, one of my protagonists in the book, Stefan Adaskas, is the epistemic integrity of democracy. How do we know what we know? Once they successfully dismantle this, then really anything can happen. We can return to a dark age. We can, drop into fascism, or whatever its modern equivalence is. And so this is why I want people to adapt this evidence-based worldview, not for the scientists that I characterize, but for themselves, for our societies, for a better future. People have to return to an evidence-based worldview, to let facts and not feelings kind of decide, how we collaborate, what is really the reality, that we start negotiating and then, build policy on top of each other. And at the moment, we are going in the wrong direction and very fast when we talk about the US, and we have to hold the line and try to stem the tide. And so this is why I try to go out, talk to people, try to create this awareness that this is what is currently happening. And I don't think anybody, even the people that might be aligned politically with some of these projects, necessarily want to live in the world that they would ultimately create, where evidence gives way to power. Yeah.
That's correct. No, that's true. That's very true. Thank you very much, Dr. Philipp. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving the space.